And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today we begin our 14th season. This is episode 1401. It's June 17th, 168th day of the year. Just 197 days remain and the year's over with. And we start a new one. On this day in 1944, for those who are interested in history, Iceland officially dissolved its union with Denmark, declared itself an independent republic. 1976, NBA and the ABA announced a merger, bringing the Denver Nuggets and the Indiana Pacers and San Antonio Spurs and New York, or now Brooklyn Nets, into the NBA. And it's also that day in history, in 1994, when O.J. Simpson led police on a famously televised low-speed chase in a white Ford Bronco through Los Angeles. I remember sitting and watching it, and everybody's oohing and howling over Simpson and some of his craziness. Interestingly enough, there's also quite a number of news stories on this particular date. The congressman who owned 24 restaurants, wins a primary and targets Senate power. He was a President Trump-backed, wins the Oklahoma Senate primary, vows a push for the Stall Save Act. He's a Republican vying for a seat in the Senate, wondering why his possible future colleagues can't pass a key voter ID and citizenship verification bill. I have to wonder that myself. Representative Kevin Hern, Republican of Oklahoma, literally cruised to a primary victory in the Sooner State. Told Fox News Digital in an interview that the one thing he hears from voters constantly is whether Congress will pass the Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility, or Save America Act. We'll see what comes of that. You know, there's a lot of folks who say that the only ones that should be voting in American elections are Americans, and yet the Democratic Party wants to open a door and say, come on down to everybody. Well, President Trump wins 2 and loses 1. Georgia billionaire delivers a rare blow to the endorsement machine. Well, he wasn't on the ballot on this particular night, but President Trump's immense clout over the GOP faced more tests and high-stakes Republican runoffs in Georgia and Alabama yesterday. While the power of a Trump endorsement, Republican primaries didn't escape unscathed. Trump-backed candidates won 2 of the 3 top races. One setback coming against a billionaire businessman who shelled out over $100 million of his own money to push his campaign. Representative Barry Moore, House Freedom Caucus member and longtime Trump supporter who was endorsed by the president, defeated rival Jared Hudson, the former Navy SEAL sniper who was supported by some top names on the right, and solidly led Alabama's GOP Senate runoff. In battleground Georgia's Republican Senate runoff, an 11th hour endorsement by President Trump this past weekend helped boost Representative Mike Collins, a MAGA champion, to victory over former college football coach Derek Dooley, who was backed by popular conservative Governor Brian Kemp. Collins will face Democratic Senator John Ossoff in a general election in a race that's among a handful that will likely decide if the GOP holds its majority in the chamber in the midterms. Well, Floyd Mayweather facing felony charges. And why did my screen go blank? Anyway, he faces felony charges after allegedly bouncing a check on a $200,000 luxury watch. Floyd and Money Mayweather built a fortune around his famous nickname. Now he's got some serious explaining to do. The undefeated boxing icon's facing serious prison time after allegedly writing a bad check for a luxury timepiece in Las Vegas. Clark County prosecutors slapped a 49-year-old fighter with 2 serious felony charges, including theft of property valued at over $100,000 and passing a check with intent to defraud. Authorities say Mayweather's alleged theft stems from a shopping trip on New Year's Eve in 2024 when he set his sights on a rare Audemars Piguet watch. Paid with a $200,000 check from a Wells Fargo account, but the bank returned it for insufficient funds. Boutique owners reportedly spent over a year trying to collect the cash quietly. Even sent a certified demand letter to avoid a public scandal, but Mayweather allegedly ghosted him. Criminal summons followed, and Mayweather's defense team appeared on his behalf in a Las Vegas court on Monday. If convicted on both felony charges, self-proclaimed billionaire faces a maximum of 24 years in prison. And the $200,000 bad check appears to be just the tip of a massive financial iceberg. Mayweather is currently buried under a mountain of debt, including a $7 million federal tax lien from the IRS for unpaid back taxes. Well, we'll see how he talks his way out of this one. President Trump vows ultimate consequences for Iran's violations for reneging on ending the nuclear aspirations. President Trump continues to work to forge a peace deal in the Middle East, working with leaders of the Group of Seven. President Trump promises the U.S. is not investing any money in Iran, arguing its memorandum of understanding is better than the failed Obama-era JCPOA. President Trump praised Qatar on being on the front line of regional tensions and touted that country's plans to invest more than $1 trillion in the U.S. President Trump said the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu must be more responsible with Lebanon, while insisting the two leaders still have an unbelievable relationship. President Trump said Ukraine peace will be the focus after Iran, urging Russia to make a deal and saying he'll do whatever I can to stop that war. Vice President Vance expressed skepticism about Iran's intentions, saying he wanted to figure out how real they are. Tankers in the Gulf prepared for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, according to maritime intelligence reports. G7 leaders discussed using new supply routes other than the Strait of Hormuz that could be opened to transport oil and gas out of the Persian Gulf. And Israeli drone strikes killed at least 4 people in southern Lebanon as Iran told Israel they should expect a strong response. Well, I guess you can say Iran may be down, but it's not out. It continues to threaten and battle its sabers. Well, Lauren Silverman breaks her silence on getting pregnant with Simon Cowell's child while married to somebody else. She's Simon Cowell's fiancée, reflecting on what it's like to find out she was pregnant with their child while she was still married to somebody else and all the media storm that followed. In a recent interview on Happy Mom, the podcast, 48-year-old opened about the end of her marriage to businessman Andrew Silverman and finding out she was pregnant with her and Kyle's now 12-year-old son Eric, who, while still married to Silverman. Well, there's many emotions that went with that because it was the end of my marriage, obviously, she said. One of the hardest times in my life because I don't want to say regretful because I don't regret anything, but I do wish it had happened a different way. Kyle and Silverman made their relationship public in 2013 after news broke she was pregnant with this child. And news of their relationship and pregnancy caused a firestorm, with her husband filing for divorce shortly after news of her pregnancy became public. She went on to say she wishes she could go back and take away the hurt and take away the pain that her actions caused her ex-husband and their son Adam. And that scandal was heavily covered by news outlets, with Silverman now explaining that made it difficult for her to enjoy her pregnancy, saying her main priority was just to keep Adam shielded and protected. Well, Kyle's had an interesting history, no question about that. Well, a fast food giant's been dethroned as a customer study crowns America's new favorite restaurant chain. America's favorite fast food chicken chain has been knocked from the top spot in a closely watched customer satisfaction ranking. Chick-fil-A, which topped the annual American Customer Satisfaction Index in 2025, fell to second place this year. Jersey Mike's claimed the first place with an ACSI score of 84 out of 100, edging Chick-fil-A's 83. It marks the first time in over a decade that a new chain has led the ACSI's quick service restaurant category. The latest study, released on Tuesday, is based on 16,464 completed surveys conducted through email between April 2025 and March 2026. The ACSI described Jersey Mike's as a new leader among quick service restaurants, adding it was the first time in more than a decade that a new chain led the quick service category. Report credited Jersey Mike's for maintaining high customer satisfaction while rapidly expanding its restaurant footprint. Well, we don't have one around here, but I've heard a lot of good things about that chain. Well, far-left Democrats keep saving Republicans from themselves. With the nomination of Graham Plattner in Maine on June 9th, the Democratic Party's record of advancing extreme left-wing progressive candidates for Congress has begun to take full form. Initially, Democrats are set to enter the midterm general election cycle potentially with a slate of nominees whose positions and backgrounds may do more to help rescue the GOP than anything the Republicans have done or will be able to do for themselves. Despite an arguably favorable political environment for the Democrats, who led the generic congressional vote by 5 points, a divided Republican majority in both chambers, and an extremely angry electorate who now gave President Trump a job approval rating of 40%, about 4 points below what it was at this point in the 2018 cycle. The Democratic Party has yet again taken steps to shoot itself in the foot before what may have been emerging as a 2018-style landslide. Plattner, who's been deeply embroiled in scandal after scandal, just became the new Democratic standard-bearer in Maine, securing a slightly more than 70% of the vote, and in turn risking Democrats' chances of flipping a crucial seat needed to win control of the Senate come November. Yes, Plattner, the man known for the Nazi tattoo on his chest, certainly is causing a lot of ripples, I guess you could say. Well, a Texas plane crash has left one dead and more injured after a business jet catches fire on a highway. Crashed on a highway in Texas, caught fire on Tuesday night. Plane was carrying 6 people when it crashed on Loop 20 in Laredo, Texas, shortly after 10 p.m. That's according to Jose Baez, an investigator for the Laredo Police Department. He also said a vehicle struck by the aircraft wasn't immediately clear if the person killed was in the aircraft or on the ground. Conditions of those on board the plane wasn't immediately known either. Authorities generally didn't report serious injuries on the ground, although 5 responding officers were transported to the hospital for smoke inhalation, according to Baeza. Loop 20 was closed after the crash and was expected to remain closed into Wednesday morning. The plane involved in the incident was a Cessna Citation Latitude twin jet. That's according to data from FlightAware. The plane departed the Los Cabos International Airport in Mexico at 6:19 p.m. NetJets said in a statement the crash involved one of its planes. The company said it was working with authorities. Well, the SPLC official allegedly funneled $1.2 million in to a neo-Nazi informant who was a secret romantic partner. Top Southern Poverty Law Center official has been accused of helping funnel more than $1.2 million in donor funds to a confidential informant who infiltrated a neo-Nazi organization. Source prosecutors say was also the official secret romantic partner. Details revealed in a superseding indictment filed June 2nd by the Department of Justice against the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has faced mounting scrutiny over allegations that funded individuals tied to extremist groups it publicly opposed. A lot of stories circulating about some of the shenanigans the SPLC has been involved in. According to the document, the director of the SPLC's intelligence project was in a secret romantic relationship with a paid fuel source. That source infiltrated a neo-Nazi organization known as the National Alliance at the direction of the SPLC. The SPLC director reportedly shared a home with the source and allegedly used a fake company to funnel charitable funds to the partner. A significant portion of that money reportedly ended up in a shared bank account used to fund their life together. Well, all kinds of things going on behind the scenes. Well, want to know about potential socialist showdown between President Trump and a D.C. mayor? Well, votes are pouring in. Socialist Washington, D.C. mayoral candidate Janice Lewis George holds a lead in her bid to replace outgoing Mayor Muriel Bowser as midnight passes on the East Coast and the ballots continue to be counted throughout the night. Associated Press reports that as of 12 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday morning, George is the leader with 52.6% of the votes after 66% of the votes has been counted. Next closest candidate, Kenyon McDuffie, sits at 36.8%. Nation's capital has been at the center of the Trump administration's nationwide crackdown on crime during his second term, and he sent the National Guard into the district last year, which proponents have argued directly correlates with plummeting violent crime numbers. President Trump's also suggested he'd order other federal takeover of Washington, D.C. if the crazy socialist mayoral candidate was elected. I don't know what the fascination is with the socialist philosophy, but they go out and dime me to be leading New York City. Well, while Mexico defends sovereignty, cartels have imported a flesh-eating parasite into Texas. As New World screwworm returns to American soil for the first time since its eradication 60 years ago, Texas is now on the front line of Mexico's threat to U.S. sovereignty and national security. The return of the New World screwworm to the U.S. began with a collapse of the biological containment barrier in Central America that broke in 2021, when millions of illegal aliens were moved through the Darien Gap, overwhelming border controls and expanding the cartel-controlled smuggling corridors that later carried infested livestock northward. By the time the Mexican authorities confirmed the first cases in November 2024, the parasite already spread across Central America and deep into southern Mexico. Mexican officials' complicity in cartel control over these routes turned mass migration into a gray zone weapon that expanded smuggling infrastructure and increased pressure on the U.S.-Mexico border. If you've never been to Panama and the Darien Gap, it is a world like none other. We did some operations in that area back in the 70s. And somebody could be standing 2 feet away and you never see them. Well, Trump DNI picked braces for Senate grilling as a temporary stand-in feels of Democratic pressure. Former Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Walter J. Clayton will face senators at an expectedly tense confirmation hearing to become the Director of National Intelligence on Wednesday. Forum comes amid Democrats' leaks-long uproar over President Trump's temporary pick for the job. Home builder Scion and Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Bill Pulte. Clayton's currently serving as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, which is considered the most prominent of the dozens of national posts, with alumni ranging from Rudy Giuliani to Preet Bharara. Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat of Arizona, top Trump critic, expressed to reporters Tuesday concerns over Pulte that actually helped push Clayton through following his Intelligence Committee appearance. And we'll see how all that comes out. It's certainly causing a lot of concerns. Two New York Democrats openly root against Team USA in the World Cup while competing for a seat in Congress. Well, imagine, if you will, a time in U.S. history when politicians facing each other for a seat in Congress would openly root for teams beside the U.S. to win the World Cup, especially at a time when the World Cup was being played on U.S. soil. Just when you thought you'd heard it all from the Democratic Party, along comes Representative Adriano Espaillat, who's seeking re-election to a sixth term in Congress, and fellow Lib Dareliza Chevalier, who's seeking her first trip to Washington, D.C. They're currently battling for New York's 13th congressional seat. During a segment on the NYC TV station PIX11, the two were asked a simple World Cup question. This is as big as a softball as you're going to get in politics. And the media routinely asks the Democrats softball questions. The host asked, who are you rooting for while discussing the World Cup? Espaillat currently gets an annual salary of $174,000 as a member of Congress. Chevalier is seeking that salary and the power that comes along with it. So clearly, you'd expect them both to say the USA. Espaillat, with a big smile on his face, said, I like Mexico. Undaunted by that answer, not sensing she might want to show some loyalty to her country, Chevalier is backed by New York Mayor Zoran Mandami. Stayed true to her lunatic liberal roots. When it was her turn to answer, she said, I'm rooting for Senegal. Well, she's made it clear she hates the U.S. Gone on social media and declared the U.S. as a effing disgrace, wiping her dirty hands with the American flag. She's written that Israel doesn't exist. She's declared in the past that a world without borders, just like a world without prisons or police, is possible and necessary and the only moral way to move forward. Well, a lot of folks have said the Democrats have lost their way, and this is just more evidence. Well, one of America's most dangerous fault lines reaches its highest stress levels in 1,000 years, according to a new study. As stress increases along the Southern California fault lines, so does the likelihood of a dangerous earthquake. With a new study putting a concerning spotlight on an area, Cajon Pass, just 50 miles from downtown Los Angeles. It's a critical junction where two of California's more powerful fault lines meet. Been quite accumulating stress levels matching 1,000-year highs, according to new research. An earthquake there would be devastating, not only to the state of California, but to the country. Well, today we're going to talk about something you don't hear much about. The Polish Roswell. Immelsen is a village that nobody outside its residents and a handful of local officials from nearby Opole Lubelski has ever heard of before May of 1978. A few hundred folks, fields, forests, muddy roads, one of tens of thousands of similar places scattered across eastern Poland. Sits in Lublin province in Opole County, nearly 125 miles from Warsaw. Far from any roads somebody could travel without a specific reason to be there. And yet, on the morning of May 10th, 1978, this is exactly where the most famous alien abduction case in Polish history took place. And that case still remains open. Not because there's a lack of material, quite the opposite. Over the years, more evidence piled up than in many Western cases that made it into the ufology textbooks. The problem actually lies elsewhere. In the nature of the place, in the nature of the man who lived through it all, in the nature of the community that took the case under its wing and nearly destroyed it in the process. In 1978, Immelsen had no electricity. A light bulb was still an abstraction there, something from another world. Same world that brought city news and newspapers and party bulletins about the triumphs of socialism. The village actually moved to its own rhythm, rooted in the 19th century far more than communist Poland. The cottages remembered previous generations. The fields were worked the same way the grandparents had worked them, and a horse and cart were still the primary means of getting around. In the Polish countryside of that era, folklore and folk beliefs weren't relics of the past. They were the living fabric of everyday life. Demons and devils and mysterious creatures from the forest had appeared and vanished without warning. All of this ran through that country, that village's collective imagination, right alongside the church and the holy icons. And many researchers today point out that the same motifs, small non-human beings, abductions, and strange medieval medical practices, show up in both Slavic folklore and modern accounts of encounters with non-human intelligences. Whether that's a shared cultural tradition or a shared source of experience is a question that still remains open. But most of the villagers at the time weren't asking those kind of questions. They had their feet firmly on the ground, worried about the harvest and the livestock. Whatever couldn't be explained got a shrug and nothing more. Then everybody went back to work. Life was too concrete to waste time on nonsense. Well, it was in a place just like this, among people like these, that one farmer said one morning he'd stepped aboard a strange flying craft and let non-human beings examine him. His name was Jan Wolski, 71 years old in May of 1978. Spent a lifetime working the land, no ambitions beyond the boundaries of his own farm. No experience at all with the media, celebrities, or public attention. Man who called a helicopter a colicopter incorrectly, and it's exactly what makes his case so hard to dismiss. Well, Wolski had no motive to lie. In communist Poland in 1978, you couldn't make a fortune off a UFO story. There was no Western sensationalism industry here. No agents, no book deals, no TV shows paying for controversy. The attention that eventually came was more of a burden to him than a benefit. And when a psychologist put him under a microscope, the results showed that Wolski was mentally sound, no tendency toward confabulation, and no symptoms suggesting hallucination or perceptual disorders. As far as he was concerned, he was telling his subjective truth. What he described had really happened, at least from where he stood. And that doesn't close the debate, of course, but it opens it in a place that many other cases never reach. His case doesn't rest on his word alone. In the meadow where the beings had led him, the farmer's son and a neighbor found two cleared tracks in the mud that same morning. Footprints running through the grass in a direction that matched the old man's account. And at the edge of the clearing, torn grain stalks and stems that were found in the crops, which some researchers interpreted as signs of sample collection. And there was another witness, a young boy named Adam Popielek, who testified he had seen an object flying over the forest that morning. Now, of course, none of this is laboratory-grade evidence. Nobody brought back a metal fragment from the craft or a sample of unknown material. But what did remain was enough to make dismissing the case entirely an intellectually dishonest move. The Immelson case became the most significant and most hotly debated event in the history of Polish ufology. And as tends to happen in Poland, the community that took it on proved perfectly capable of fighting over it with a passion better suited for far weightier matters. For decades, methodologies and ambitions and personal grudges collided, and Wolski's case became a hostage to wars that had little to do with him. On one side stood Zbigniew Blania Bomar, popular sociologist with ties to the communist secret services. He spent years building an iron case for the farmer's credibility and called Immelson an impregnable fortress. On the other side was Bartosz Rutkowski, who in 2013 announced the findings of an investigation suggesting the whole story was a result of a hypnotic scheme cooked up by another ufologist. Both versions, of course, are strange. Both have their supporters, and both deserve to have a closer look. So let's go back in time to the early morning of May 10th, 1978, to the dirt road between Immelson and Dabrawa Luzyanska, where a 71-year-old farmer hitched up his horse and set off on a ride he came back from with a story nobody in that village had ever heard before. We're going to talk about every detail of the event, every investigation, every argument, every scheme. You can then decide for yourselves whether what happened to Janowski was real or a carefully orchestrated hoax that put an innocent old man into something he never asked for. But one thing is certainly clear. Something happened that morning. Exactly what happened is what we're going to talk about. Now, May of 1978 in communist Poland looked decent enough from the outside. At least that's what the television shows wanted you to think. News anchors on the evening broadcast talked about record harvests and new factories. Edward Garrick's shook workers' hands on assembly lines, and newspapers ran daily reports on socialism's latest victories. It was a decade Garrick himself called the Great Leap Forward, and for a few years a lot of Poles actually bought it. Western loans poured into the economy. Roads were built, housing projects went up, factories opened up, store shelves were briefly stocked. Ordinary worker could actually afford a small car. But by 1978, that river was running dry. Shelves that had been full were empty again. And asking when things would be restocked got you a shrug. Workers gritted their teeth at their jobs. Nobody talked loudly about what Poland owed Western banks, but numbers were bad enough that keeping quiet was a smarter move. And in the village of Eastern Poland, all this arrived late and in a softened form. Not because life was easier there, because it certainly wasn't, but the countryside ran on its own clock when it had nothing to do with 5-year plans. The land needed plowing in March, regardless of what the party said. Cow needed milking at dawn, no matter what the current ideological line appeared to be. And that was what you found in Immelsen. Sat near Polish Lubelski in what was then Lublin Voivodeship, the flat agricultural stretch of the Lublin region, and from the air would have looked like a patchwork of fields and forest and dirt roads chewed up by tractors and horse-drawn carts. To find it, you had to drive to Opole Lubelski first and then turn onto a side road and follow it until the buildings stand out and asphalt disappeared under sand and mud. Had no electricity. After dark, people lit kerosene lamps, just like they had in the previous century, same as their fathers and grandfathers had done. The only connection to the outside world was a battery-powered radio that carried news and music and official announcements from Warsaw. Television set was practically a foreign concept. You actually needed power to run one, and there was no power after dark. And that was the world Janowski lived in. He was born May 29, 1907, don't you know? In the spring of 78, he was turning 71. Spent his entire life farming. Spent his entire life in that same area. Wasn't formally educated. A few years of elementary school, as much as circumstances allowed, but he wasn't a simple man. He had a good head for numbers. Knew his animals, understood when to harvest grain and when to wait. He was the kind of person who, without any book knowledge, could look a cow in the mouth and tell you what was wrong with her. His reputation in Immelsen was spotless. In a village where everybody knew everything about everybody, reputation is currency you can't fake. Neighbors described him as honest, dependable, and sober. And that last word isn't just a figure of speech, by the way. He didn't drink. In rural Poland at the time, that was worth noting. Vodka was the social lubricant of choice, the way people unwound and spent their time together. Polska didn't need it. He had his work, his responsibilities, not much patience for idle company. And he didn't have any exposure to idle company. No exposure to popular culture. He didn't read science fiction. Barely read anything beyond what was strictly necessary. In fact, the word UFO didn't mean anything to him at all. The whole phenomenon of flying saucers, which had been gripping the imagination of millions in the West since the late 40s, simply didn't exist in Immelsen in 1978. Communist Poland either mocked those topics or ignored them entirely. No state-run newspaper ran stories about contact with alien civilizations. And that was, believe it or not, by official decree, a product of the decadent West. Most could live in a world where extraterrestrials just did not exist. not even as a concept. But he wasn't a man who didn't understand what he saw in the sky. And that's where something important comes in. He sat in an area where military aircraft flew regularly by. Nearby installations included the military airfield in Radowicz outside of Lublin and the aviation school in Dęblin, one of Poland's main military aviation centers. Helicopters and planes had been passing overhead for years. Wolski had seen them so many times they stopped registering as anything unusual. He knew what they looked like, what they sounded like, and how they moved. He called them in his own way. Kolocopters. Keycopters. Because that was his dialect, not because he didn't know what they were. He could tell a military aircraft from something he'd never seen before. On the morning of May 10th, 1978, he saw something he couldn't place in any category he had. Started as an ordinary day. He was up before dawn, same as always. Put on his work clothes, made something, grabbed the reins, and led his mare out of the barn. Had a straightforward errand to run. His horse needed to be bred. And a neighbor, Leon Rock, over in the village of Dębrowa Brzezinski, had a stallion. It's a farming task. Plain business of keeping a working household running. Time of his departure varies depending on the source. Some accounts say it was about 4:30 in the morning. Others put the whole sequence to around 8. And that discrepancy, of course, comes from the fact that Wolski lived without clocks and without electricity. He read time from the sun. Didn't track it the way somebody with a meeting schedule would. It was morning. That was enough for anybody to know. Things went smoothly at Rack's farm. By the time Wolski was ready to head home, the sun was already climbing above the tree line. Now, there were two ways back to Emilson. A paved road or a dirt path through the forest, past a clearing the locals called Belgium. Metal. Paved road was easier and faster. The dirt track was shorter and soft underfoot. So Wolski, of course, took the dirt path because his mare wasn't shod. No horseshoes. Long stretch of on hard asphalt with damaged, unprotected hooves. That was the type of logic Wolski was known for. Practical, straightforward concern for an animal he worked with every day. He pulled the horse left, turned off the asphalt, and rode into the trees. Sand and clay was under the wheels. Forest closed overhead, quiet that only a forest can hold, with birds somewhere in the background. And the mare walked steadily along. If Wolski had shod that horse, he'd have taken the road. He'd have been home by mid-morning, milked the cows, and fallen asleep that evening like any other day. History of Polish UFO research would look completely different, or it might not exist at all. Instead, he rode into the forest, and a few minutes later, he saw two figures on the path ahead. Now, according to what he said later, the air in the forest was cold and thick with morning damp. When Wolski rode between the first rows of trees, the chill cut right through his worn jacket. Just after 7 in the morning, the sun was barely getting through the alder and birch canopy, laying long, pale strips of light across the undergrowth. The forest was quiet. Kind of quiet that has weight to it. The only sounds were the steady, dull beat of the mare's hooves on the soft ground and the low hiss of the cart's rubber-rimmed wheels rolling through the ruts. Wolski sat loose on the board, reins in hand, heading home from his errand. The horse moved at its usual pace, showing no signs of anything wrong. And this stretch of forest was as familiar to him as his own yard. He knew every turn, every bend, every clearing, so when he spotted two figures walking up the road ahead of him, nothing in his chest moved. They were just a couple of people. Maybe they were mushroom pickers or hunters who'd wandered off the main trail. But as the cart closed the distance, his farmer's eyes, sharp from decades of watching animals and weather, started picking up details that didn't fit into his preconceived notion. Two figures walked at an odd gait, legs spread wider than normal, like they were having trouble keeping their foot on uneven ground. At that point, Wolski started to squint. Clearly, they were short, remarkably short. Put them somewhere between 4'7" and 4'11". Not much taller than a 10-year-old child. And their clothing was nothing like anything he'd ever seen on a villager or a soldier. Both wore identical, form-fitting suits, dark blue, shading in the black and gray. The material clung tight to their bodies with no visible stitching, no zippers, no buttons, no clasp of any kind. Suits ran seamlessly into hoods pulled up over their heads, leaving only their faces and hands exposed. And on the backs of their necks, just under the fabric, Wolski noted two distinct raised shapes, small symmetrical protrusions sitting where no protrusions had any business being. And when the cart came within a few dozen feet, the figures glanced back. He looked at the farmer coming up behind him and slowed down. At that point, Wolski saw their faces. Skin was dark, olive green, strong cheekbones. Eyes were dark and distinctly slanted. And as the mare pulled level with them, they split apart with quiet precision, one stepping left and one stepping right, making room for the cart to pass between them. In the mind of a man shaped by 71 years of farming, there was no frame for science fiction, no box for alien contact. His mind did what practical minds do. It found the nearest reasonable explanation, held on to it. Slanted eyes, olive green skin. Well, his conclusion arrived fast and with complete confidence. These had to be two Chinese. He had never seen an Asian person in the flesh, but the association was there and it settled him down. And as for the strange suits, well, some kind of modern protective gear, specialized clothing from somewhere he'd never heard of. He didn't press any further, followed the old country habit of offering a ride to anybody on foot. But he didn't slow down or speed up. He drove that cart straight between them. What happened next contradicted everything about the way they'd been walking. With speed and ease that had nothing clumsy about it. Both figures launched off the ground and landed on the moving cart, one on each side of him. What Wolski later described in his own words as coming up light as a feather. They sat down on either side of him. And the moment they landed, the cart lurched hard and the wood groaned under him. For bodies that small and slight, the weight was completely wrong, far heavier than their size had any right to be. And that was the first thing that cracked his composure. They sat with their short legs hanging off the sides of the cart. And from that distance, with them right next to him, Wolski could see the details clearly. Their feet enclosed in dark footwear that was part of the same suit, widened at the front into something that suggested a flipper more than a shoe. The real shock came when he looked at one of their hands, between each finger from the base down to the first knuckle. There was a thin web of skin, greenish, translucent, unmistakable. Same thing he'd seen countless times on ducks and frogs. Well, his two passengers didn't pay him any particular attention. They began talking to each other, but the sounds they made weren't speech in any sense. Wolski could recognize. The words, if there were words, came fast and close together, high-pitched and sharp, running into each other without pause. He described it later as a kind of chirping like birds, with the quick clucking of pigeons, like something that moved too fast and sat too high in the throat to be human language. Couldn't pull a single recognizable sound out of it. Well, he sat with them in silence, face half hidden under the brim of his worn cap, and the cold wind against his cheeks. He didn't shout. He didn't try to knock him off the cart. He didn't panic. That calm, which later became one of the most discussed aspects of the whole case, came from the same place his whole life had come from. Plain, grounded practicality. They got on. They weren't hurting him. They could ride. He figured they were probably just grateful to be off their feet rather than slogging through the morning mud. And the chirping filled his ears, cutting over the forest sounds around him. And the mare, who was still calm, kept pulling the cart deeper into the trees. And then Wolski noticed something else threading through the noise. Sound had nothing to do with the birds or the cart or the two figures beside him. Low, steady, a hum like a bumblebee trapped in a jar. Well, at this point, the trees began to thin out. The cart rolled out past the stand of elders, and Jan Wolski lifted his eyes from the horse's back. Above the morning dew on the clearing ahead, something was waiting for him. The cart rocked gently on the rutted sand road as it rolled out from between the thick rows of alders and birches. And the forest had grown completely quiet. The only real sound was the fast, unintelligible chirping of the two strange passengers perched on either side of him. Sounds came quick and close together, what Wolski later described as falling small and dense, pressing against his ear, steady and unbroken, threading through the creak of the cart and a thud of hooves on soft ground. Now, he'd been riding like this for a few minutes now. The two figures that had joined him sat calmly, legs hanging out the side of the cart, showing no particular interest in where they were going or how fast. Whatever the conversation was they were having, if it was a conversation, carried on without him. He held the reins and kept his eyes on the horse. But then the trees began to thin out. The cart moved out of the tree line and into the open air. It was in Bethlehem Meadow, clearing the locals knew where, a stretch of open grassland surrounded by forest that he'd ridden past and through more times than he could count. That morning it looked different. Not the clearing itself, of course. The wet grass, the pale sky, the smell of damp earth were all the same. What was different was what was hanging above it. He raised his eyes past the horse's head and stopped moving. Hovering roughly 15 to 16 feet above the meadow was a large white object. It made no noise beyond a low, steady hum he'd already been hearing, the one he'd compared to a bumblebee sealed in a jar. But now, seeing the source of it, the scale of the thing hit him. It wasn't small. He estimated it at roughly the length of a bus and about 15 feet tall. A squat rectangular mass, wider than it was tall, holding itself in the air with no visible means of doing so. His first thought wasn't spacecraft. His first word for it, recalled plainly in later interviews, was a car in the air. It was the frame his mind reached for, not science fiction. He didn't have any science fiction to draw from. Just the nearest shape in his experience that came close to what he was seeing, stretched to accommodate something that didn't quite fit anything he knew about. Shape of that craft was boxy. Not a dome, not a disc, not any of the sleek forms that had populated Western science fiction for decades. Wolski described the roof as similar to a barn roof, a gentle pitch, familiar, almost agricultural in its plainness. The walls were straight and vertical. The whole thing had a proportion of a large, stocky structure that had simply been dropped from somewhere and left hanging in the air. Surface was completely white, smooth, with a faint pearlescent quality in the morning light. What held Wolski's attention was not the color, but what was missing from it. There were no seams, no rivets, no bolts, welds, joins, or panels. The hull looked like it had been formed from a single piece of material. One continuous surface with no sign that any hand or tool had ever been put to it. No windows, no lights, no wings, no fins, or anything suggesting how it stayed up in the air. The walls, which he could judge by the thickness around the open rectangular hatch on the side, were about 8 inches deep, solid all the way through. And in each of the four corners of the craft, a device was mounted. Wolski described them as barrel-shaped or cylindrical, set vertically into the corners with long, dark extensions projecting both up and down from each barrel. He called them drills or augers, and they were spinning fast enough that the individual shapes blurred, fast enough they threw off something like a faint iridescent shimmer in the air immediately around them. What was strange about the spinning was what it didn't produce. There was no downdraft, no wind, no displaced air, no grass bending below the craft. Metal grass sat perfectly still under a machine that should, by any ordinary logic, have been flattening it. The only thing that rotated, the rotating produced was that hum, low, even, monotonous, not loud, not aggressive, just present and constant, sitting underneath everything else. The mare had managed the two passengers without complaint. This she couldn't manage. The sound and the sight of the object hit the horse in a way nothing Wolski could do would override. She began pulling sideways toward the alder thickets at the edge of the meadow, planting her hooves and refusing to go any further. Wolski pulled back on the reins, but she resisted. And she was stronger than he was at the moment, and he was a strong man. One of the figures beside him reached out and grabbed the reins. The pull was immediate and unmistakable. That creature was small, slight frame, narrow in the shoulders, not built like anything Wolski would call physically powerful. But the grip behind that reach was something else entirely, far beyond what a body that size should have been capable of. Between the two of them, Wolski hauling on one side and the figure pulling on the other, they got the mare stopped. She didn't calm down by any means, but she did stop. Two figures stepped down from the cart with the same fluid ease they'd used to get on board. Their feet pressed into the soft, dew-covered grass and left impressions behind them. trapezoidal prints, concave on the underside, different from any boot print Walski had ever seen. One of them turned toward him. No words, just a gesture, clear enough. He wanted him to come with him toward the craft. Well, Walski got out from his cart. He wasn't running away. He wasn't frozen. He walked. And that was the thing that puzzled researchers for years afterwards. 71-year-old farmer, alone in a clearing, being gestured toward a hovering machine by small green-faced beings, and he went. He described it as calm, a settled feeling he couldn't account for. It wasn't exactly bravery. It wasn't recklessness, just the absence of the panic that should have been there. And he tied the mare to keep her from bolting and walked across the wet grass toward the craft. When he got close to it, a platform began to lower from the open hatch above. It came down on four thin cords. Walski described them as looking like string, the kind used to type a parcel. The platform itself was a flat board, nothing reinforced, nothing that gave any structural reason to trust it with a person's weight. He compared it to a child's swing. One of the beings stepped on first and gestured for Walski to follow him, so he got on. The platform didn't move, it didn't sway, not a dip, not a fraction of an inch of give under the full weight of a grown man added to whatever the being beside him weighed. Held with a rigidity that had no explanation in anything Walski understood about how ropes and boards behave. He stood on it, and it felt like he was standing on solid ground. And then it rose, straight up, directly into the open hatch. Went up fast. And here again, something was absent that it should have been there. No lurch at the start, no pressure on the stomach, no sensation of the body catching up to itself the way it does in an elevator or a rising vehicle. Walski felt none of that. The ground simply dropped away below him, the hatch closed overhead, and he was inside. The transition between those two states had been, as far as his body could tell, seamless. The interior of the craft was dark, not pitch black. Light came in through the open hatch behind him. Rectangle of pale morning sky. But beyond that, there was no other source of illumination. The walls were black with a grayish tint, the same color as the being's suits, and they absorbed what little light there was rather than reflecting it. The ceiling was slightly curved. Running along it, a thick, dark pipe or tube ran the length of the cabin. Along the walls were row benches, attached by cords or straps. 8 to 10 of them arranged around the space. No visible controls, no screens, no instrument panels of any kind. Only the benches, those walls, and a single rod-like device near the wall. It was black, ending in a small spear. Each one of the figures is moving slowly across a set of small openings in the wall surface. 2 more figures are already inside, identical to the ones from the road. Same height, same suit, same olive green faces. He watched him without alarm and without any expression he could read. And then Walski looked down. At his feet near the base of the open doorway was a group of birds, large black rooks and jackdaws, the kind you would have known on sight from any field near Emmelston. They lay on the floor of the craft and were moving. Wings shifted, legs twitched, heads turned. The eyes were open, but they couldn't fly. The hatch was open behind them. Clear sky visible, and not one of them made any move toward it. They were laid as if held down by something invisible. Animate, aware, but grounded, unable to do the same thing their bodies were built to do. Walski looked at him for a moment, and then one of those figures stepped toward him. Well, the ride home was roughly 500 yards, and Walski covered it at a full gallop. When his cart swung into his yard, he tied the mare off quickly and went straight inside. The wife saw his face before he said a word. Not the face of a man who'd had a normal morning. She asked immediately if something had happened to the horse. Walski stood in the middle of that room and told her if the boys went past the birch trees, they'd see monsters and a strange vehicle hanging in the air. The word he used for those beings, Podwaraki, roughly translates as little creatures or little monsters. That was a word he'd keep using for the rest of his life whenever he described them. It wasn't a dramatic word, simply the closest thing his vocabulary had. His sons were in the yard when he arrived, when they heard what their father was describing, small green-faced figures, a machine hovering above the meadow. Their first instinct was the same one most people's would be. They feared it was probably a scout troop that had camped in the woods overnight. When Walski added the vehicle was enormous and floating in the air, and interpretation stopped working. And they can see from his manner he was not confused and not joking. He didn't joke about things, and he didn't confuse things. Something had happened out there. They knew it from the way he stood in the room. It took about a half an hour before the group was ready to go back to the clearing. And delay wasn't cowardice, it was the cautious, collective logic of a village community. There were neighbors to notify, people to round up, because going towards something unknown felt safer in numbers than alone. By the time they reached Bethlehem Meadow, the craft was gone. But what remained was enough to stop people in their tracks. The grass across the clearing was marked with 3 distinct swaths running in different directions. Each one pressed flat in a way that wind or animals couldn't produce. But it was the footprints that drew the most attention. Pressed into the soft, still, dew-covered soil, the impressions unlike any boot print the men had ever seen. Trapezoid on outline, concave on the underside, wider than a human foot and shaped differently from one. Walski's sons and the neighbors who had come with him followed the tracks across the meadow and into the surrounding terrain. They traced him over 650 feet, crossing a small stream before the trail vanished into the undergrowth as though whoever made those prints had simply ceased to be on the ground. There was no clean explanation for any of it. The ground stood in the meadow, looked at the evidence, and walked home. Nothing else for anybody to do. What the family didn't know that morning was that the departure of that craft hadn't gone unnoticed. Several residents of Emilson heard something before Walski even returned home. A large, jarring boom that seemed to come from underground rather than from the sky. Kind of sound that rattles windows and sends people to their doors wondering what broke. Others in the village reported seeing an object moving above the forest that morning. Though most of them kept that to themselves, at least for a while. The silence that followed was its own kind of evidence. When television crews arrived in Emilson in the weeks and months after the incident, they found a village that largely refused to talk. Not out of ignorance, out of calculation. These were people who understood from long experience what happened when a small community becomes a spectacle. The cameras would come and go. The reporters would write what they were going to write regardless. And the village would be left behind, living with whatever reputation the coverage assigned them, long after the journalists had moved on to another story. So most of them chose silence. And as some admitted years later, they chose it deliberately. They simply wanted to be left alone. Well, the one crack in that silence came from a child, 6-year-old Adam Papilovic, who'd been playing outside that morning when something in the sky caught his attention. His mother, startled by the loud boom that shook the neighborhood, had run out of the house calling for her children. But when young Adam came to her, he brought news of his own. He'd seen that strange aircraft above the trees. He described it as shaped like a bus, its color blending into the blue of the sky. Then he added a detail that stopped the adults around him. Through one of the windows, he said he'd seen the pilot. Had a green face and a black cap pulled tight over his ears. Adam hadn't spoken with Jan Walski before describing what he saw. He was 6 years old. Had no motive, no cultural framework for fabricating a story that aligned so precisely with the accounts of an old farmer he had not yet had any contact with that morning. His younger sister had been with him and reported he saw the object as well. Testimony of those 2 children, unsolicited, independent, consistent with Walski's account and details they couldn't have borrowed from him, became one of the most difficult pieces of the evidentiary record for skeptics to dismiss. Well, as you might guess, the case didn't stay local for long. Within days, word had traveled beyond Emilson. The first investigators already on their way. But the facts on the ground as they stood on that morning of May 10th, 1978, were simple. 71-year-old farmer described an encounter that lasted several minutes in precise and consistent detail without wavering. Physical traces were found at the location he described. A child who hadn't spoken to him had independently reported seeing an object matching his description in the same place at approximately the same time. And several other villagers had heard an unexplained sound at the time the craft would have departed. And the community around all of this had gone on quiet the way communities go quiet when they've decided collectively that the truth is more trouble than the silence. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow and talk more about the Polish Roswell. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.